In Chapter 2, we'll be talking about the cell. The cell is once again the basic unit of life, meaning that it is the smallest structure that has the different characteristics of what life contains. It has three basic parts to it. It has one, the plasma membrane, which I'm drawing out right here. This plasma membrane will separate the outside environment compared to inside the cell. It also not only contains that, but it has a cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is this region from the plasma membrane to the nucleus. So everything that's contained here is part of the cytoplasm. It's not just the fluid. The fluid itself is called the cytosol. So the fluid that you see here is called the cytosol. It's part of the cytoplasm, but it is not the cytoplasm. The organelles are all these other different structures that you see here, and each of these microscopic structures have a specific function. And we'll talk about these different organelles later on in this chapter. The last part of the cell is the nucleus that you see here. This nucleus contains DNA and is the control center of the cell. The DNA will end up getting transcribed into mRNA. The mRNA will then go to the cytoplasm and get translated into proteins. And that's why it helps regulate protein production. Since the plasma membrane separates the inside of the cell compared to the outside of the cell, what's inside the cell is called the fluid inside the cell is called the intracellular fluid. Once again, that's the cytosol, and that's the fluid within the cell. Everything outside of the plasma membrane is called extracellular fluid. Like the name implies, extra means outside or extra, while intra means within. Okay, so the fluid within the cell is the cytosol. The fluid outside of the cell is going to be the extracellular fluid. There's different types of extracellular fluid. The first type is the interstitial fluid, also known as tissue fluid. So this is outside of the cell, but still within the organ. So this is the fluid within the organ, but outside of the cell, interstitial fluid. Plasma is the fluid within the blood. So the blood within blood vessel, the fluid portion of blood is called plasma. It contains certain ions, electrolytes, sugar, oxygen, carbon dioxide, things like that. And then the final type of extracellular fluid is the lymph. And lymph is the fluid within lymphatic vessels. And we'll talk more about the lymphatic system later on in this particular semester. But it will carry fatty droplets and also immune cells and whatnot. The plasma membrane, it has different components to it. It has the selectively permeable or semi-permeable aspect of it. And what that is, it means that it is very specific in what goes into the cell or out of the cell. It doesn't allow just anything to come in or go out. It's very selective, and that's why it helps regulate what comes in and out of the cell. It also contains something called a glycocalyx, and you see these sugar molecules right here. And these sugar molecules helps the cell to identify itself. It's made up of both glycoproteins and glycolipids. The glyco portions are these sugar parts of the proteins or sugar parts of the lipids that will help the cell to recognize, oh, this cell is mine, so let's not attack it. Versus if there is say a bacteria that invades like we get a cut and invades into our bloodstream, then our immune cells will be able to go, hey, that glycocalyx, we don't recognize that. Let's attack it so it prevents it from getting infection. The plasma membrane is composed of phospholipids, and these are these structures that you see here, these little red circles that you see around here, with these fatty acid tails that hang within the plasma membrane. These are phospholipids. The proteins are these blue structures that you see here. And there's different types of proteins. And cholesterol is these yellow structures that you see here. Okay? They all have a specific function of it. But you'll notice that most of it is going to be made up of these phospholipids. And you do see interspersed within the phospholipids these proteins. And because of the interspersedness of, not a word, but of the proteins, it makes it look like a mosaic. It's fluid because it is not static, meaning the phospholipids that you see here, they don't just stay in place. They are constantly moving around all the time. And because of that, it has kind of like a fluidity to it, and that's why the fluid portion of the fluid mosaic model is from that fluidity part. Okay, like I said earlier, the plasma membrane is composed of these proteins and lipids. A lipid is a biomolecule, and what a biomolecule is are these molecules that make up life, or life molecules. And there's 4 types of biomolecules that you'll need to learn within this entire semester. One is carbohydrates, the others are proteins, which we'll talk about next, lipids, which we're talking about right now, and nucleic acids such as like DNA and so on and so forth. So these biomolecules, lipids are hydrophobic, meaning that they are afraid of water. Doesn't like to interact with water because it is nonpolar. Nonpolar, it does not have any charge whatsoever. So water has it's polar, meaning that they're slightly positive in certain areas and slightly negative in other areas. And because the lipids are nonpolar, it doesn't like to interact with water. Just like salad dressing, Italian salad dressing, how it separates the oily, separates from the water portions of it. So this lipid here, there's different types of lipids. There's the phospholipid. The phospholipid makes up this bilayer. The phospholipid, once again, are these circles and these tails that hang in, underneath it. It's called phospholipid bilayer because there's 2 layers of it. There's one layer that goes like this, and another layer that's just underneath it. Okay. So if we look at one phospholipid by itself, it has a head that's polar. Okay, that's the polar head. It makes sense that it's on the outside or on the inside of the cell because it's either going to be facing the extracellular fluid or the intracellular fluid. While the fatty acid tails are going to be nonpolar, and hence why it's going to be within the plasma membrane. It doesn't want to interact with the extracellular fluid or intracellular fluid, so it's going to be remaining within the plasma membrane itself. The cholesterol, these yellow structures that we talked about earlier, help stabilize the cell depending on different temperature changes. If it gets really cold, the plasma membrane starts to be less fluid. The phospholipid stops to move as much. The cholesterol will help it be a little bit more fluid in that case scenario. Or if it gets too warm, it becomes too fluid and the cholesterol will help prevent it from moving as much. The glycolipids, once again, are these phospholipids that have these sugar molecules that come off of it. And once again, it's part of the glycocalyx to help the cell recognize itself. Proteins, there's different type of proteins. They're made up of these amino acids. Oops. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. So proteins are made up of these amino acids, and those amino acids will make multiple amino acids will make these proteins. And proteins, there are parts of it that's going to be hydrophobic and parts of it is going to be hydrophilic. The parts that are going to be closer to the outside of the cell or inside of the cell are going to be hydrophilic, while those that are going to be within the plasma membrane itself is going to be hydrophobic. There's different types of proteins. There are transmembrane or integral proteins. Trans meaning it goes across the membrane. Here is a transmembrane protein. here's another one, here's another one, so on and so forth. These transmembrane proteins, there's different types of transmembrane proteins. There's these channels, and the one I circled earlier is a channel protein, where it allows certain things to go into the cell or go out of the cell, depending on what kind of channel protein we're talking about. And these channel proteins help make the plasma membrane selectively permeable. There are receptors, and receptors, let's just say that this is a receptor protein. They'll bind to certain specific molecules, and usually these receptors will cause a signal transduction. What that means is it's helping to communicate things from outside of the cell, like a hormone. It'll bind to the receptor, and it'll cause communication within the cell. Enzymes are these proteins that help increase the rate of reaction, and that's what a catalyst does. It increases the rate of reaction. So things like, say, some of the brush border enzymes within the small intestine to help digest molecules to become smaller molecules, they will end up increasing the rate to break these molecules down quicker. Intercellular connections we'll talk about more in the tissue chapter, but these proteins will attach one cell to another and have different types of function for those. There's also these peripheral proteins. And peripheral proteins tend to be on the inner surface of the cell, or it could be outer surface of the cell, but it's only going to be inside or towards the outside. And then this is going to be usually communicating from one protein to another, or one protein to an enzyme, so on and so forth. Then there's the glycoproteins, like we said earlier, are these sugar molecules that come off of the protein to help recognize itself. Microvilli are these structures that come off of the plasma membrane. They are part of the plasma membrane itself. So here, if we look at one of these cells over here, and let me just flip it around and redraw this cell. So what I'm drawing right now is the microvilli. Here's the nucleus. The microvilli allows lots more surface area. So if we're talking about, like, say this is a digestive cell in the small intestine, it makes it be able to absorb a lot more molecules into the cell, compared to if it has only a flat apical surface, apical meaning the top surface, it can only absorb at this part of the cell, and it's not going to be as much compared to if you're absorbing in all these different directions because of the microvilli. So it's part of the plasma membrane that just curves up and down to increase the surface area. So I'm going to stop right there for this particular part of our chapter, and I'll continue on the next video.